You're listening to Death of the Reader. Flex and Herds here with your Murder Mystery World Tour, and we are here discussing all the way to the end of Agatha Christie's iconic And Then There Were None, with Sean Britten in the hot seat. Herds and I both knew the solution to this one, so we brought him on to see how he'd go, having bested Christie in the past. And Sean, my goodness, I do feel bad because we've both become so used to each other's antics. We know each other's every tell. So over the past couple of weeks when we've just been leading you down the wrong garden path.
Yeah.
I feel that was very unfair. I came here to have a good time. I feel attacked right now.
I think you should, honestly. This has been an assault over the past couple of weeks. I do have to apologize, but it all is in good fun. I think it's all part of the game. Because what else is a murder mystery but a competition between two minds that are the detective and the culprit, except in this case, it was the same person.
I will say, when we started this format on, not on Death of the Reader, but on a previous show, 4 years ago now.
Too long.
I was right where you were, Sean. I was so in the deep end, and I listen back to those recordings now, and I think to myself, how did I ever believe anything this man said? He's obviously lying.
The whole way through.
So I know how you feel. And it is painful, but my goodness, what a fantastic ending to this book. Yeah. You can see how it has cemented itself in history with this big twist and then the message bottle showing up at the end, unveiling the whole crime for something that is so just ridiculous in the way it is constructed.
Shall we, before we get too stuck into the solution, Flex, I know you're eager to rip into it, but shall we recap the story?
I think we shall.
Just for today, for this last time. 10 little Indians went out to dine. One choked his little self, and then there were 9.
9 little Indians sat up very late. One overslept himself, and then there were 8.
10 little Indians traveling in Devon. One said he'd stay there, and then there were 7.
7 little Indians chopping up sticks. One chopped himself in halves, and then there were 6.
6 little Indians playing with a hive. A bumblebee stung one, and then there were 5.
5 little Indians going in for law. One got in chancery, and then there were 4.
4 little Indians going out to sea. A red herring swallowed one, and then there were 3.
3 little Indians walking in the zoo. A big bear hugged one, and then there were 2.
2 little Indians sitting in the sun. One got frizzled up, and then there was 1.
1 little Indian left all alone. He went and hanged himself, and then there were none.
I think you mean known. There were known.
There were known.
There were known. No, but yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed reading this story through again. We just have to give a quick shout to the bear, which may be the most ridiculous of the killings.
Yep.
A man killed by a bear, and that marble statue bear was up in like the second chapter.
I will admit that was a hell of a setup. That was a great setup.
It's a long shot, and a lot of the deaths are long shots in that respect. They all kind of call back and call forward to the solution as well, with the red herring being our man Armstrong. Like, this story as a whole is so interestingly like interwoven with itself. I don't know. I really appreciate that.
There's a level of mythos to this in terms of how Agatha Christie actually went about putting this together and the revisions that she went through and all of the different iterations that this story had to make sure that the premise of the secret killer defeating everyone, including themselves, was pulled off to the utmost. And you can see that the little games that Agatha Christie plays with things like the bear, with things like the red herring, she knows you are so deep in the deep end and can't swim.
Yeah. Sean, how did you find this? Because this is your first time reading. Have you had a chance to go over the story again, or?
Well, basically, since finishing it up, I must admit I sort of looked into not so much going over the story again, but looking over some of the different versions and the way in which it had been translated onto film, translated onto stage, and basically to keep that sort of secret going, they'd resulted in different outcomes, different killers in many of the adaptations.
No, it's a very interesting story, and how it's been changed in that sense, that it's been adapted with different endings. And that's something that I don't know if this is the first movie to do this, but the movie Clue, I know, was aired with different endings depending on which theater you went to see the movie in. I don't know if there is like a true ending, but I know that if you get the DVD copy, you can see all of the different solutions.
Very much in the spirit of the board game too.
Yeah, exactly. I guess that's something that I love about this story, is that it is interwoven. Everything pays off in a very specific way, but also everything kind of leads you to the solution, because the solution to this story, surprising surprising Sean, but surprising no one else. Let's be real here. The solution is, of course, that the character pretending to be the detective, the armchair detective, which is a trope seen in murder mystery, Justice Wargrave, is the killer, and he's not so much using technical know-how. What he's doing is he's manipulating their paranoia and their suspicion of each other to get, what he wants.
I must admit, when I first came across the solution, I felt a bit cheated. I was like, fair. Right. I was actually, as you know, the solution I came up with last week was the young lady, Vera Claythorne.
Who does have the gun at the end of the story.
And
very suspicious.
And literally, I was feeling very happy with myself up until the point where the police detective goes, yeah, she hung herself, and then the chair was put neatly away in the corner. Look, I got to say, I felt cheated, and then I was sort of thinking it over. I'm going, well, God, there were some clues there, aren't there? There are some clues that absolutely I missed that glaring in your face of how did Wargrave die if not killing himself, supposedly without either an 11th person on the island or him doing himself in, such as it were. So yeah, like I did think it was quite clever. I felt a bit sore at first, but then I thought it was quite clever as it came together.
The thing I do love about that, and we'll talk a bit more about the actual specific mystery elements in the tail end of the show today, but the thing I love about the way that they deliver that to you is that it's never outright mentioned until the culprit's confession what the truth is. So you have these little nods like, oh, the chair was pulled away. Oh, this was different. That was different.
Yeah.
And it makes it so much more tense as a reader who's trying to solve it, going into a finale where the character detail is so sparse. We are basically just left with the sheer panic of the last three characters on the island. And that panic is underscored by your panic in realizing all of the little things that poke holes in your solution. And it's an amazing example of how the mystery of a story can actually be used to build the tension, where so often it can be a detractor because you're so caught in the technical know-how. And that's why I think the social deduction point is so effective in this combination.
We even get a scene, there's one scene that's kind of stuck in my mind where we actually see Armstrong and Justice Wargrave talk about, well, you see, I have a plan. I have a plan to catch the killer. Justice is going to pretend to be dead, and Armstrong is going to confirm him to be dead, so then they can catch the killer unawares. But of course, Armstrong is, falling into his trap there. And it's those kind of scenes, the way that Agatha Christie, continues to play with your predisposition to suspect anyone and to try to read into scenes that actually causes you to fall deep in the rabbit hole.
Armstrong was definitely sort of that weaker character, character looking for somebody to lead him into something. And I must admit, I was going through it and I basically thought red herring. I did think he was a red herring in the sense that he was the most likely to be an accomplice, not the actual murderer. But, he ultimately
you didn't realize that he fell for a red herring and not just you falling for a red herring. And it's one of the brilliant just games that Agatha Christie plays with the poem there.
Yeah. I mean, look, the man's name is Justice Wargrave. You might say he has a war on justice to put people in graves, you might even say. It's ridiculous.
It's very George Lucas, that name.
It's truly terrible. Mr. Savage oppress. There's a lot of talk that he brings to the table about how anyone could have done this, even the most weak of us, even the most, he's like shuffling up in his chair, like, I'm an old man, but even I could kill someone if I really wanted to. And yeah, that's it. That's the answer.
And it's great at sort of an early point, and he's the one that brings up the idea that death is the only thing that will absolve anybody from being a suspect in this one. And he's like, well, there you go. You set that one up nicely, didn't you?
Yeah, it's kind of fun. That's almost become a murder mystery trope on the tail end of this story, in that the only way to actually confirm a character is dead is to kill them yourself.
Look, that's the thing, right? If only Lombard or Blore had said,
just put a safety bullet through his head.
Bullet, put a knife wound in, cut off their heads, sort of thing. Make sure that the dead can't come back like zombies.
And that's why Justice Wargrave is Hertz's favorite criminal in murder mystery history.
He's pretty good, but I don't know if that's true. I don't know if that's correct.
We are discussing To the End of Agatha Christie's iconic And Then There Were None, here with Sean Britten on Death of the Reader. We will be back with more of that and the solution at the end of the story. You're listening to Death of the Reader here on 2SER 107.3. You're listening to Death of the Reader. Today we are discussing Agatha Christie's groundbreaking novel, And Then There Were None. We are joined now by the prestigious Dr. Catherine Noske from the University of Western Australia, author of the Salt Madonna, a newly released tale of ominous miracles and small town woes. Catherine, welcome to the show. It's so good to have you.
Thank you. It's lovely to be joining you guys.
It's great to have you on the show. On the show here, we like to tackle complicated stories that their authors have spent months and years poring over in order to get the puzzle just right. Catherine, it took you over a decade to put together this manuscript of a book. We dealt with many island-bound stories recently in Death of the Reader, and it seems that the story of an isolated island takes a lot longer in the oven than most stories. What is it about their tight confines that pulls out the inner perfectionists of the authors that write island stories?
I think partly it's the challenge of writing an island. An island is a complex place. It's a world in microcosm, in a sense. And, you have the sort of classic crime scenario of the locked room. Writing an island is writing a locked world in a certain way. It's got to be rich and complex enough to hold itself up. And imagining your way into that space takes time. Living with that space, I think, is the most wonderful way to write. So, look, partly for me, it was a long, slow process by dint of the nature of how I was writing and why I was writing. It started as my PhD. It was a project and a book and a story that needed time and needed space to really come into its own as a world.
To dive into the sort of, I guess, the structure of the story, I really enjoyed the framing device of our protagonist, and I use that term so loosely given how many perspectives we have that we jump between. Hannah recollecting the events of the story almost like a diary of what occurred during her return trip to look after her dying mother on the storm-battered island of Chesil. This trope of a fictional character writing their own story has always fascinated me ever since I read A Series of Unfortunate Events by Lemony Snicket. Hannah, she seems to be working through her own feelings of powerlessness and regret for her sin or her trauma, perhaps, of inaction. In your own words, how does that relate to the sort of overarching thesis of the novel?
To me, that was all tied in with the idea of the sort of Gothic subconscious and the way in which, so the Gothic for me was a really important sort of area of research when I was working on this as my PhD. And Hannah's sort of lost in the past in the same way that the subconscious functions in the Gothic as this sort of well or place of trauma that is unresolved and live and, unrelentingly erupts into the moment and into the day-to-day. This idea of memory and of diary and of being caught across two times and two sort of structures of tense in the novel as well. So Hannah's writing in the first person, and then we're imagining other characters in third person. That for me was all really tied into that idea of being sort of caught in another time, being caught in one's own history and unable to move past that.
Yeah, I really like there that, on that note, Hannah even chastises herself at one point for the admitted sin of portraying Mary, who occupies a position like a damsel in a story, as completely powerless, becoming a puppet for the townspeople. However, the story is predominantly told by groups outside of the adult men. Other than that one scene from the perspective of the bull, the story is told by daughters, mothers, children, and an old pastor losing his mind. Why tell a story of a damsel in distress that is so actively absent of the male gaze? What do we stand to learn from bending that typically patronizing narrative?
Oh, I like that question. Women and female perspectives were really important to me. They were very much at the centre of it. But more specifically within that, I wanted to sort of hit a balance between speaking about trauma and speaking about, the sort of suppressed crimes that we have in our history as a society, in our contemporary moment too, really. So a balance between speaking about that trauma and speaking over it or for it. So wanting to acknowledge that, some things are impossible to speak, some things are really hard to represent in writing, and that people, often aren't empowered, don't have a voice, so can't speak their own trauma in ways that is listened to or acknowledged. So for me, writing around what happens to Mary was the only way to represent that in the book. It's sort of a Mary-shaped hole in the middle of the text.
I thought it was really powerful reading about Mary without, we don't really see her perspective after she loses her agency in a very real sense. And there are sins that are committed on the island that are core to the story that are never really exposed either. I find it interesting. You contrast the emotional bearing of the heart of Hannah through the story with one of her ancestors who wrote reports when the island was first colonized about, seeing the animals and counting the indigenous population. I guess my question is Hannah doing something healthy in the way that she's trying to portray these events? Is this a helpful thing for her to do in your mind?
No, I don't know that you'd call it healthy. I think you would call it compulsive. But also I think you'd probably say that in some ways there is a reckoning with the past that is still to come and needs to happen slowly but surely in our society in terms of colonialism and decolonising our contemporary world, which, for a white person is always going to be difficult to do in ways that are healthy, because that's a process that needs to be led by Indigenous voices and Indigenous speakers. We need to, take the position of ethically listening and remove ourselves from action in some ways from that process. And I think Hannah is sort of caught in the challenge of both wanting to enact that reckoning and being unable to do so without causing more harm herself in some ways.
Yeah, I really like the way that you frame that as like a compulsion, because, there's definitely, I guess, a desire to right wrongs, but also that contrast in terms of how that actually plays out when you put it into the social and historical context, both in the novel and with the more broad social issues you mentioned there.
Yeah, and there are some elements in the book there that, I don't know that I did particularly well, to be honest. There's some things that need a lot of thinking about in ways that are respectful and ways that are productive. But for me, Hannah was sort of epitomising that sense of being trapped in one's own history and in the acknowledgement of having caused and created trauma as a society and not knowing how to get past that, or not knowing how to, move forward in a way that won't perpetuate trauma.
I feel like that desire to depict the truth and to depict things respectfully is very well channeled, I would say, through the character of Hannah throughout the story. Now, Catherine, I have to admit that I love a good cult in a story of fiction, and your novel does such an excellent job of showing, mostly reasonable human beings growing into madness. From one very simple sin that occurs about halfway through the book. I have to ask, do you think you let the townspeople off just a little bit easy for the terrible atrocities that they brought to bear on the young people of the town?
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
I'm glad to hear it. Thank you.
Yeah, and it's funny that you use the word sin there as well, in the sense that to me was part of why I got so fascinated by this idea of cults when I was writing, and I did a lot of reading around that. So, I mean, some of my favourite cult novels are Randolph Stowe's Tourmaline and Laura Elizabeth Willett's Beautiful Revolutionary. There's some amazing narratives there of how a cult sweeps up and carries on in its own way. And yeah, so in that sense, the collective madness was sort of reckoned with in a way that individual crime or individual, sin, I suppose you could say, is not ever punished. But I think that's something that we need to deal with socially as well. We have grand gestures in our society towards acknowledging trauma or acknowledging crimes, but we don't always do so well at actually dealing with the individual perpetrators or recognising individual fault.
Alrighty. Well, I suppose on that front, we will wrap that there. Catherine, thank you so much for joining us here on Death of the Reader. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on.
It's been lovely. Thanks for the chat.
You're listening to Death of the Reader. Catherine Noske there talking about the Salt Madonna. We will have links up on the podcast if you want to get yourself a copy of that book, and we can thoroughly recommend it. We are discussing Agatha Christie's And Then There Were None, and we'll be back with more of that in just a second. You're listening to Death of the Reader. Flex and Hertz here for your Murder Mystery World Tour. And we are here to discuss the solutions, the mystery, the puzzle of Agatha Christie's And Then There Were None, with Sean Britten in the hot seat. Sean, You pinned Vera as the culprit in this mystery, and despite a last-minute escapade with a gun, she was not the criminal. It was, in fact, Justice Wargrave.
To be fair, she was a killer in the end.
It's true.
She did shoot a man.
Realistically, if you are trying to pick a killer in this story, you could have correctly picked just about anyone.
It's fair.
I'll go with that. Yeah.
Full points. Yeah. I mean, it is true, though. Out of all the characters you could have picked, you did pick the one who survived the longest and was able to, kill someone on the island. So congratulations to Vera.
If this was a Hunger Games-esque story, perhaps this would be a worthy victory.
Yeah, you might say that you earned 1/10 of a point.
Oh, I'll take that. Add that to the tally. I mean, as I said, look, I was feeling very good about my solution, as I was mentioning the evil alter ego that kind of revolved around the sea and seaweed. I thought I was really onto something until I saw that bit about the chair had been moved after she hanged herself.
Unfortunately, I think that we get a little bit too much of Vera for her to be the killer by the end of it. We see her interpretations of other characters and these discussions that she has with MacArthur and Emily Brent. Like, she's illuminating them, but in a way that we see her internal thoughts, and she's talking to Emily Brent, and she says, "Oh my goodness, Emily Brent is a monster." But if she was already there to kill everybody, would she have that reaction?
I think part of it came down again, and maybe I'm just giving myself an out.
That's okay.
Excuse.
It's part of the fun.
But I guess part of the interpretation of mental illness in that particular character, I think I was seeing her as somebody who was genuinely a bit nuts, and you have to be a bit nuts to do this thing on the island. I think Agatha Christie's reaction was like, well, this is just what a woman would do in that stressful situation.
I wasn't going to say that, but glad you said, Sean.
Well, funnily enough, when we look at our rules of murder mystery, one of the least favored is the fifth of Noxes, which is that no Chinaman must figure into the story, which is to say that the obvious outsider shouldn't be the one that does it. And one of the interesting things that I think the modern print versions do better is that because they've stripped out a lot of the anti-Semitic material, it actually makes the mystery better because so much of the original text points out that Justice Wargrave is Jewish, and he then becomes that Chinaman outsider in this story that not only kind of undermines the game a bit, but it also means that we have one of those clues taken away, and it becomes less about the stereotypes and the mentions of him being predatory and like an animal and hunting through this entire story hits so much harder when you then go for the reread.
Yeah. I think that this story is made a lot stronger because Justice is able to essentially tell us his philosophy, that anyone can be a killer. Because that isn't just about the people on the island. That's about anyone who comes into his court of law. And in a sense, then, this island is his court of law, and he is the only one. He doesn't have a jury to try and persuade with speeches. He has a group of 10 that he has judged guilty, and all that remains is to carry out their sentence.
I mean, you will at least be walking away with 1 point today, Sean, I think, on account of the way that you pinged to that discrepancy of justice in the story and the way that clearly someone was out for vengeance on account of the terrible things the other characters had done. I guess the other question we had then, Sean, was as a reader coming through and seeing the solution, you mentioned that you felt cheated, and obviously, you always feel a bit cheated when you're wrong at the end of a murder mystery. That's just the feeling. But was there any particular detail that you think back on in this story and think of as the cheating moment, of the cheating element?
Yeah, I did question how he managed to get carried up the stairs with not so much as a grunt or sort of a rising chest.
That is, we have to assume when we're talking about the mathematics, the mathematical theory of murder mystery, that when the culprit walks into a room with an innocent person with any kind of murder weapon, they will die instantly. That is how a murder mystery works.
That is the element of fantasy to the locked room, is that once the door is locked, anything can happen behind
the fantastical mathematics of murder mystery.
Exactly.
I think it's just got the makings of a good comedy skit where they're bringing Wargrave up the stairs. Oh, watch his head. Oh, jeez.
Armstrong's like
dropping him back down the stairs and a great big tumble down the stairs. Oh, we'll go get him. It's okay. He's dead. He can't feel it. It's fine.
Yeah, it's no problem.
And I think maybe by the fact that Armstrong was so suckered so easily, you've really got a guy telling you, look, pronounce me dead and it'll be fine. Just pronounce me dead and then I'll figure it out from that point on, when obviously the killer, if there was somebody else, is going to know they didn't actually kill Justice Wargrave. I mean, if you've been told, pronounce me dead, the killer's going, hang on a second, how'd that happen? I was off doing this other thing. But then I must admit, like I say, it set it up quite nicely. On reflection, I realised there was really nobody else that could have done it other than perhaps an Anthony Marsden or an 11th Man, and I was kind of past Anthony Marsden by that point. So I was kind of like, well, no, actually, that was quite cleverly done.
It also is quite interesting that of all of the deaths, in quotations, Justice Wargraves is the one that feels the most final, because all of the others, they're poisons, they're disappearances, aside from the axe to the back of the head. I forget that one. It's in very veiled language that it says to you that we can't actually see the wound, we can only see the blood. So if you accept the word of the characters that it is a gunshot wound, you immediately think, oh, well, the back half of his head's just been blown clean off. But we don't actually see that on the page, and it's, again, the type of trick that tends to show up in these everyone in the cast dies murder mysteries where it's only possible in text, because if you were to show it on screen, the way it works wouldn't be convincing.
I must admit, I was very distracted at that point. I distracted myself with the thought of how they silenced the gunshot. That was my mystery at that point in time. I was like, how did the killer silence the gunshot? And I got wrapped up in that more so than who actually did it, I guess, or who possibly could do it.
Yeah, this is always the point you have to come to when you're solving any murder mystery. When the novel is asking you one question and you can't think of a solution, the answer is probably that you don't need to ask that question. Because the answer isn't how did they silence the gunshot. There isn't even a question there. The question is, was there a gunshot at all? Right. I think the tone of the novel also is. It's much grimmer, I think, than most murder mysteries of the age. The humanity of the cast and the sense that, everyone will die by the end is really tangible. It creates a sort of sense of fear as well.
It is interesting, the humanity, just on the basis that they are largely horrible people.
Yep.
Vera is terrible. She did a terrible, terrible thing. Lombard did a terrible, terrible thing. And they're almost our protagonists at the end, and we're still so caught up with them as viewpoint characters that we are kind of dismissing their actual actions in the past, and the quality of their character.
And I think that's one thing, often we just kind of say the Murder Mystery World tour at the start and just go on our merry way, not really addressing how the tour goes, because we don't want to spoil you on too many books by pointing out where the illusions lie. But if you look back at the past few books we've covered, from the Tokyo Zodiac murders to this, I think you can hopefully see the kind of map that we've tried to lay out in terms of the detective having to be a just individual, the way to create atmosphere and a sense of finality in a cast full of terrible people, trying to look at the technicalities of reworking this style of puzzle that Agatha Christie innovated with, and then there were none. And now we've landed here. And obviously you, Sean, coming in here, being thrown in, as I said at the start, the absolute complete deep end. We can see with a kind of set of fresher eyes why it's still so great to read today.
Yeah, I think the only thing that I think stood out to me by the end as being a little bit silly was that they just kind of told the people around the island that they were doing a Survivor Island thing. And they're like, please, if you hear any gunshots or any screaming or people dying, if you see blood on the windows, please do not come and help. That's a bad thing.
Yeah, I kind of liked that the fisherman was basically like, they were all told that story, but the fisherman was like, hang on, that sounds like nonsense. This literally, no, I'm going to go check out what's going on. And it just happened to be the storm, obviously, that kept him away. But I did like that there was a character that goes, this doesn't sound right.
Yeah. There's a problem here. Maybe we should check on the 10 crazy people on the island.
Yeah, well, I mean, without the storm, could have been a very different sort of story.
Yeah, I've thoroughly enjoyed getting to revisit, and then there were none. But I think it's about time that we embark on a new adventure.
A new adventure?
Sean, you will not be joining us for this, but this is tangentially related to the last time we came up on the show when we covered the murder on the Orient Express. We were on a train. There was a killing of a rich man. Point being, we're going to be going on the Last Express starting next week. We're going to be doing two episodes. We're going to be covering this video game, which I know is blasphemy on the show. But this is a game that came out in, 1996, I want to say. And it's a huge part of my childhood and why I got into murder mystery in the first place.
Yeah, Herds has been pushing to do this since we started the show.
Since the first day, pretty much.
And I figured that we should revisit Agatha Christie before going on a little journey with interactive fiction. We'll have a few things up. By the time you're hearing this, we'll already have done a few live streams on the internet of us actually going through the interactive stuff we're going to play.
We'll be covering on next week From Paris all the way to Vienna.
Sean, thank you so much for joining us here on Death of the Reader. It is a pleasure, as always, having you on.
Anytime.
You are listening to Death of the Reader here on 2SER 107.3. We are Flex and Herds. We'll see you next week with Jordan Mechner's The Last Express. Don't miss it. This is your Murder Mystery World Tour. We're out of here.